In the capitalist world, the Soviet Italian known as Lada is fairly familiar. Many have seen it on the road. Some even owned one, and almost everyone knows it was a copy of the Italian Fiat. But few realize that there was also a Polish half-brother of the Fiat. Only true enthusiasts of Eastern Bloc cars could really tell them apart. Everyone else most likely saw the Polish Fiat at some point, but mistook it for a Lada. The resemblance is that strong. But these were two completely different cars, and the Polish Fiat had its own, no less fascinating story. That's the story I'll tell you in today's video. If the Soviet Union began active cooperation with Italy's oldest car manufacturer only in the 1960s, the Poles had started much earlier. Back in the mid-1930s, right up until the start of World War II, they were producing Fiat 508K cars under license. After the war, continuing that partnership became impossible. Poland ended up within the Soviet sphere of influence, and the two sides now stood on opposite sides of the ideological divide. So instead of Fiat models, the new Polish car factories started building the Gaz M20 Pobeda, which received its own local name, Warszawa. Unlike the Soviet version, the Polish engineers didn't stop at one body style. They produced sedans, station wagons, and even pickup trucks. When production of the Pobeda ended in the Soviet Union in the 1950s, replaced by the Volga, Poland once again returned to the idea of working with Fiat. Relations between Moscow and the West were slowly warming, and the timing seemed right. The Soviet Union itself was also moving in the same direction. There's a separate, detailed video about that. You'll find the link in the pinned comment. The decisive step came in December 1965, when a contract was signed to produce Fiat cars at the passenger car factory near Warsaw. Poland received a production license, part of the equipment and full technical documentation. All of that cost around $3 million, which was a huge amount for not-so-wealthy Poland in 1966. Everything is relative, though. Around the same time, the Soviet Union made its own deal with Fiat, worth nearly $1 billion. In the USSR, the agreement had plenty of critics. They called for developing domestic technology instead of buying it abroad. One of their main arguments was that Fiat sold the Soviets an outdated model, the 124, while giving the Poles a newer and more advanced 125. That idea couldn't be further from the truth. Despite their similar appearance, the 125 was built on a different platform, the one from the Fiat 1300. Its engine was more powerful and had twin overhead camshafts. The 124 had a single camshaft located below, and that difference led the Soviet side to ask for a redesign. They wanted a more traditional overhead valve layout. The Italians reluctantly agreed, and the Soviet version of the Fiat received an OHV engine. It might seem like proof that Poland got the more modern car, but there was a catch. The Polish 125 lost its twin-cam engines. Fiat offered simpler power units that were not very different from those used in the 124. They had overhead valves and a column-mounted gear lever, which, by the mid-60s, already looked outdated. As a result, the Polish Fiat turned out to be less advanced, not only compared to the Fiat 124, but even to the Soviet Moskvich 412 that was being developed around the same time. Another old-fashioned detail was the rear leaf spring suspension, which the 124 no longer used. At least the looks of the 125 were fine. Personally, I'd even say it looked a bit nicer than the 124. When the design was adapted for Polish production, the exterior was simplified. 4 square headlights were replaced with round ones, which sometimes makes the car resemble the later Vaz 2103. The Polish version also received bumpers from the Fiat 124, making the two cars look even more alike. The Polish car kept a few technical advantages of its own. The flat fuel tank was moved above the rear axle, which made the car much safer than the Fiat 124 and the Lada, where the tank sat inside the right rear fender. The Polish version also retained disc brakes on all 4 wheels, inherited from the Italian 125. The Vaz 2101 used drum brakes, after pressure from the Soviet side, which preferred a more durable solution. The Fiat 125P proved a bit simpler and more affordable than the original. That suited both the Poles and Fiat, which avoided competing with its own model. Fiat even offered the Soviets the simplified car as a second licensed model, but the components were not compatible. The USSR insisted on building an upgraded 124. That decision produced the Fiat 124 Speciale, and the previously mentioned Togliatti-built relative, the Vaz 2103. The first production cars were assembled in Poland in the autumn of 1967. In 1968, the factory built 7,000 cars, and a year later, that number had already doubled. By 1975, FSO was producing around 115,000 cars a year. Unlike Vaz, which could launch entirely new models, the Polish plant kept improving the same one. In 1969, the original 60-horsepower engine was joined by a new 1.5-liter unit with 70 horsepower and an electric cooling fan. In 1972, the Polski Fiat 125P finally lost one of its outdated features. The gear lever moved from the steering column to the floor. A year earlier, the engineers had developed a station wagon version called Kombi, which later made up about 20% of total production. There was also a pickup version, just like the old Warszawa had. In 1975, more than 400 updates were introduced. The car could be easily recognized by its new plastic grille with paired headlights. Plastic was already replacing chrome in car design at the time. The interior changed too. Headrests appeared on the seats, and the chrome horn ring on the steering wheel was removed. Both engines gained 5 extra horsepower. Not a huge improvement, but certainly welcome. Over 10 years, the Polish engineers moved the Fiat 125P much further away from the original design than the Vaz team did when they upgraded the 2101 to the 21011. Togliatti didn't have to keep modernizing a single model again and again. By the late 70s, the factory was already producing 4 different sedans, along with the Vaz 2102 station wagon and the off-road Niva. The successor to the 125 was meant to be the FSO Polonaise. The licensing agreement with Fiat was set to expire in 1983, but production of the 125P didn't stop right away. Both models were built in parallel for several years. After the license ended, the car was renamed FSO 125. The less powerful 1.3-liter engine was dropped, and soon a diesel version appeared with a Volkswagen engine. Because of the high price, though, very few buyers chose the diesel model. The final step in the long evolution of the Polish Fiat was the introduction of a 5-speed gearbox, the last touch in the story of the 125. For socialist countries, exporting cars was always an important source of foreign currency. The Poles were no exception. They exported their 125 models not only to other socialist nations, but also to capitalist ones. The first export market for the Fiat 125P was Finland, which wasn't part of the Eastern Bloc. There were also right-hand drive versions for the United Kingdom. And some Polish Fiats even crossed the Atlantic to Canada. What's truly remarkable is that Polish Fiats were exported to Italy itself. The Italians didn't mind, since by the mid-1980s, their own lineup had already moved far ahead. Both the Fiat 125 and the Soviet-built 124 were seen as outdated and posed no real competition to modern Italian models. In Italy, the FSO 125 was viewed as a curious bit of automotive exotica, a retro oddity with a strange name. Between 1967 and 1991, Poland produced about 1.5 million units of its 125 model. Roughly 40% of them were exported. There's one prototype that deserves special mention in this story. A curious concept car the Polish engineers unveiled in 1977. It was a rural crossover concept, supposedly built using components from the Lada Niva. The word supposedly matters here, because no solid evidence has ever been found. Still, considering the close cooperation between socialist countries, it's hard to imagine another source for such a project. The car was called the Fiat 125P Kombi 4x4. If it really was based on Niva's mechanical parts, its off-road capability must have been impressive. In other words, by 1977, Poland could have entered a niche that had almost no competitors. At the time, the market offered only rugged, tractor-like off-road vehicles, or the newly launched Niva itself. Cars that could combine the comfort of a sedan with true off-road ability simply didn't exist. The 4x4 never reached mass production. The exact reason remains unknown, but the most likely explanation was a shortage of components. The Niva factory had just started production and could barely meet its own demand, leaving no parts for a Polish project. A real pity. It could have been a truly significant car for Poland. The standard Fiat 125P stayed in production until 1991, just months before the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the early 90s, when used foreign cars flooded into the former Soviet republics, the Polish 125s were almost never among them. They simply didn't feel like real imports. For people in the post-Soviet space, even East German Wartburgs and Trabants looked like genuine foreign cars, especially popular among the military. The Fiat 125P, on the other hand, was seen more as another variation of the familiar Lada, only less common and with questionable availability of spare parts, especially body panels. So, almost all Fiat 125P cars remain in their homeland, in Poland. Some have survived to this day and are still running. Others found their place in museums or appear at vintage car shows. Most, however, have already disappeared. From a historical perspective, though, the 125 deserves its place in automotive history. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this story interesting. Don't forget to support the channel with a subscription and a comment. See you in the next video with more surprising automotive stories.